Welcome viewers to another video over making decisions. I'm the decision maker today, J-Rod, and today we're going to be looking about data repeaters and setting them up in decisions. So data repeaters are really cool. The one that we're going to create today is the single type repeater, or the normal data repeater. The other one is the mixed type repeater, and we will visit that one in another video. So a data repeater is good if you want to repeat multiple items or list items on a form. And what the data repeater actually is it's a mini form on top of a parent form. So we're going to create one real quick today. So I'm just going to create a form, and this one's going to be the parent form. Typically, when you use a data repeater, you will have a parent form that you'll attach it onto. So I'm going to create a parent form. On this parent form, I'm going to have a button that just says done. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a number box to this parent form. And we're going to do something really cool where we're going to sum the total cost or a number value within the data repeater and then place that value on a form control that's on the parent form. This is just going to be the total of something, so I'm just going to call it total. And I'm actually going to add another row below the resize row. So we're going to set this to 30. It's going to be fixed. So now I'm going to move it all the way here. Perfect. So that's going to be my setup for the parent form. All right. Now, when you configure your data repeater, you must remember this one piece of information. A data repeater must be used with a data structure. It cannot be used with simple or primitive types. So things like strings, decimals, booleans, it cannot be used for those individual components. You can only use them on a composite type. So I'm going to create a database structure, and this is going to be computer equipment. And I'm going to have the equipment, the name of the equipment, so that's going to be a string. I'm going to have the quantity that we have, quantity, make sure I spell that correctly, and then I'll have an integer, and then I'm going to have the cost of it, and then I'm going to have the total value or total cost, which is going to be the quantity multiplied by the cost is going to get to total cost. So these two are going to be decimals, and then we're going to save this. So this is going to be my computer equipment data structure. You can use any of the decisions data structures with the data repeater except for the value list. I don't believe you can use a value list on a data repeater, but flow structures, database structures, entities, flow execution extensions, you can use those data structures in decisions to attach to a data repeater. Okay, so now how do we create the data repeater? Everything I just did was pre-setup work. So now this is the part where we are actually creating the data repeater. So I'm going to go and create form because a data repeater is just a type of form. And on the tabs over here, I can left click to click the data repeater row here to have access to the repeater control, excuse me. And then when I left click this, I'm going to call this my computer equipment data repeater. And then I'm going to click create. And so now it's going to open up into the form designer, and I have this tiny form that I can use and I can resize and I can use for my purposes. Now, since I already have the data structure created, so I'm going to go to properties on the main settings for the form, and I'm going to configure the input type. So this input type is saying what is the composite type that we want to use for this data repeater. It could be any type of composite type. It could be one that's default in decisions. It could be one that I just created. And for this scenario, I'm going to use the one that I just created, the computer equipment. So over here, I can have access to my recent data structure, and I can pick the computer equipment that I created. So I'm going to select pick, and then I can start configuring these form controls on my grid control here. So how I do this is I'm going to have a text box. One's for the name. I'm trying to think of the values that I had into it. There was cost, so I'm gonna have a number box. There was another one for total, and then there was quantity. Okay, so I need to add another column, so another resizable column. I'm gonna move this one here because that's total. That's gonna be the cost, and then the number box over here is gonna be quantity, and I'm gonna make sure that it outputs as an integer. And I'm gonna call this the quantity box. I'm gonna call this the cost box, and I'll call this the total box here. All right, so now notice that I have my form controls, and I have all these exclamation points. Now, what it's saying is that the data name cannot be empty. So I'm going to set the data name. So this is going to be computer name or equipment name, right? But then notice that even though I set the data name on the text, it's still throwing an error. It's saying computer name is not valid. You must set data on input type for repeater. Now, what does that mean? This means that when you use data repeaters, you must reference the data name from the input type. So what that means is in order to alleviate this error, I need to pick from data. And because I selected my input type, I have this form data that I could expand when I click on this arrow. When I click on this arrow, I have access to the name from that data structure. This is why you must have a data structure when you use a data repeater, because you cannot define custom data names for the data repeater. So I'm going to left click name, and notice that when I do that, I have this data name called formData.name. What that means is that this control is referencing the input form type, and it's going to place that value in the name column of my data structure. I'm going to do the same thing with all the other data structures. So this one's going to be the quantity. This one's going to be cost. This one's going to be total cost. And there we go. So now that I have my data repeater configured, now what I can do is I can save this, because now we are done. We have no validations. We've set the data name to the input type of the data structure. So when I click on this checker box here, I can scroll down. My input type is computer equipment. So I'm tying in those form controls to the column attributes of the computer equipment data structure that I custom defined. Alrighty. So now what we're going to do is, let's say I want to save this, and now I can attach this to my main parent form. So I'm going to close and save. I'm going to go to my parent form, and I'm going to type in data repeater here, and then I'm going to place my data repeater on my parent form. And then I'm just going to expand it and make it bigger so we can see it. Perfect. And then I'll pick the source, the computer equipment data repeater, and now I can see my data repeater. Now notice that it's a little smaller than the parent form, so I'm just going to resize my parent form just to make it fit and to make it, look better from a design aesthetic. Another typical thing you'll see individuals do with data repeaters is you will see them add as many columns as there are in the data repeater form control. The reason why is because now I can put labels over those prospective columns to say what those things represent. So now I can add labels. Over here, this is going to be the name. I'm going to add another label. This is going to be the quantity. This is going to be the cost. And then this one's going to be the total cost. All right, and then I'm going to make sure you change the label names, because that's important to remember. Change the label names. You always want to get in a habit of doing that, because it will help you as you design other dynamic form, techniques. Reference the name of the control. So because it does that, it's always good just to get used to renaming the name of the control. Okay, perfect. So now we have our name, our labels for our data repeater. So as we use this, we can see that, hey, this field right here is for the name of the computer equipment. This is the quantity that we have. This is the cost, and that's the total cost. Okay. Now, this error is saying there's no data name configured for the data repeater. So I'm going to call this computer equipment. That's going to be a list. And I can configure it here. Now, another thing I'm going to want to do is if I want to add or give the ability for users to add or remove items in the data repeater, I'm going to use two controls called data repeater add, which if you can find if you just type data repeater, and you have the data repeater add right here and the data repeater remove. So I'm going to drag this control over here, add data, and I'm going to drag the remove one over here, remove. So now the next step when you add these two buttons to your form is you want to click on the data repeater control, and you want to scroll down to the input data category of the data repeater configuration. And then you want to select the dropdown and add that control. Now notice this data repeater add button references the name of the control. So if I change this name to dr add data, then when I go back to my form, I have add dr add data. So that's what I meant earlier when saying you need to get in the habit of changing the names of the controls, because some other form controls reference each other by their name, not necessarily their data name or their text name. So I'm going to just say this is remove data dr. And then now I'm going to configure this. Click on the drop-down, add. Click on the drop-down, add. So there we go. There's my dr add button and remove data dr. So now I've configured this to say, hey, give the user the ability to add rows or remove rows from the control. So I'm going to save this. And once I save this, then I can close. And whenever we test our forms, you always create a simple flow or a test default flow. So this is going to be test data repeaters, create, and then I'm going to add the show form step onto the canvas. I'm going to pick the form that I just created. So recent parent form, because that's what I named it. And then I'm going to add done. Okay. So now when I debug this, you will see that I have the name, quantity, cost, and total cost. But now when I click the add data, I can type in values for these specific controls. And notice that my tabbing is a little off because I rearranged the controls. So I would have to fix that within the form designer. But once I fix that tabbing, then I'll have a better tabbing experience. But I can add as many rows as I want. I can also remove any rows that I want because I configured these buttons appropriately. And if I add any more, I'll have a scroll bar that will let me scroll down to the other items within this list. So that's how we configured that. I'm going to go into my data repeater control and let's fix the tabbing. This is a cool thing to know. In the data repeater control, you can have access to the tabs and its index. So notice that when I click on this text box, I can edit the tab and I see that it's tab index 1. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to check the index tabbing on here. So let's go to tabs here. Notice this one's 4. So what we're going to do is we're going to backspace, set this one to 2. We're going to set this one to 3. Perfect, it's already on 3. And then we're going to set this one to 4. This one to 4. Perfect. So now my tabbing through that control should be fine, where if I'm inside the data repeater, I should be able to tab through it from left to right, going from name, quantity, cost to total cost. So let's just test that iteration, add data, boom, 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 perfect. That behaves like I want. Okay, now what are we going to do? So let's say I have defined values for here. So let's say I have a laptop, and let's say I have 2 of these, and let's say they're each about $500, right? And let's say I have a desktop, and I have 1 of those, and let's say this one's $1750. And it's a pretty expensive desktop. Then let's say I have a server, and this is going to be a high-end server. And this one I have a quantity of 2, but let's say they're total like $4,000, or they're $2,000 a pop. So in essence, the total cost would be $4,000, but I haven't configured that yet. So to configure the total cost, I've shown this in another video called with active form flows. So I'm not going to dive too much into it. At this point of the video, I may just skip that part and just build that out so we can get to the next section where we're going to sum up the total cost and place it in the summed up cost number box here. All right, so now I've configured the data repeater to multiply the quantity and the cost to display the value and the total cost. Now the next step is we're going to tell decisions to sum up the total cost and place it in the summed up data repeater cost number box that I've created here. So I'm going to close out of this form. We're going to go into this form here. And where we want to set that up is we want to set an active form flow in the parent form to look into the data repeater here and sum up that total cost. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go to active form flows, and we're going to click add, and I'm going to call this sum up data repeater total cost. I'm going to copy this, edit the rule flow, and then I'm going to change the rule flow name to be reflective. And then I'm going to grab the sum step. The sum step in decisions allows users to pass in a list of decimal values, sum it up, and then we can choose to output it somewhere else. So now what we're going to do is we're going to select this sum, and we're going to click the input value and select from flow. We're going to find our information in form data. When we go to form data, we are going to go to the data repeater. And then after we go to the data repeater, we're going to go to the item source. And after we go to the item source, then we're going to select the all total cost list. Now this would be your data path for your variable if you have a cost value that you want to sum for all the cost form controls on your data repeater. It's going to be the form data always, your data repeater, which in this case is named by the user. So if you change the name of the control to something different, then it will be the name of that control. Then you're going to say from item source, and then you're going to select all total cost. And then we're going to click done. So this is half the battle. What we did is we told decisions to, hey, take in these values from this location. After we take in those values from the location, now we want to tell decisions to place it somewhere. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to our sum step. Now there's 2 places you can do this. We can output the data and change this to change value and use the change value of the output step and pick the path to the number box that we will be using to display the sum cost, or you can use the output mapping editor. I'm going to use the output mapping editor because it's better for illustration purposes. So what I had to do is I had to go to the all summed up number box, so that's what I named it. I needed to pass the change value to here into that value, so it's going to sum up all total cost values in the data repeater and then pass that into the value. Now I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to click Save. And now what I'm going to do is I want this one to run on the value change of the data repeater. So anything that changes within this data repeater, I want this rule flow to run. So I'm gonna click OK, and then we're gonna click close and save. And then now let's debug this. So now I'm gonna add this here. I'm gonna say I have a laptop. My quantity is 1, and let's say my laptop is 775. So I have 775 in the total cost, and then I have 775 in the summed up cost. I'm gonna add data here, and I'm gonna say desktop, and let's say I have 3 of these, and let's say they sold for about $12.50 a pop. So I have a total of $37.50, and look at that, it's summed up $37.50 and $7.75 to $45.25. Let me add another item. Let's say I have a server, and then I'm going to say I have 2 of these, and let's say these servers were about $2.50 a pop. So notice now we have the summed value of these 3 items. So displayed here in the summed up data repeater total cost. All it is it utilizes an active form flow on the parent form that the data repeater is attached to. And once you do that, you can get all the values from that item source inside that data repeater, navigate to the all total cost or your list of decimal values that you want for your sum step. And then after you do that, then you output that value to another control. Well, that's all for today. Thank you for watching another video of Making Decisions. I will see you guys next time.